12 years ago, in my home congregation in Goshen, I preached a sermon, and I talked about the need for health care, how we ought to have free health care or better health care, that process. I talked about good news for the poor would mean let's give at least a living wage so people can afford to buy food. Let's work at health care, let's work at eye care, dental care. Let's work at the whole prison system that we have here in America. It was 8 years before the congregation invited me to speak again. Far too political. But any of you who know your Bible, that's Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, brought me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind. You know, where do you make the difference? How do you distinguish? How can I be an active follower of Jesus and not care about the poor and not care about the way institutional government treats poor people? So I pass that.
Well, I have a story similar. I preached a sermon one time on Jesus' concern for the poor and simply looked through the New Testament passages. Did not suggest any political answers for it. The next few days after the sermon, I got this letter saying that this individual, he wasn't a member, but he attended regularly, was no longer going to attend our socialist church, that I should take my socialist behind, different language was actually used, and get out of town, and that if that's what we believed, that we should be taxed because of it. Because we talked about the biblical concept of Jesus' concern for the poor. And to me, you know, one of the interesting questions at this time in our history is the number of occasions when I have either read or been told that you cannot be both a Christian and a Democrat, which is just utter nonsense. I'm here to tell you that it is precisely because I am a Christian that I am a Democrat. Because the Democratic Party has historically been concerned at feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting the sick and the imprisoned and caring for them, being concerned for equal justice, being concerned about the basic humanity of all people. Those are issues which we find celebrated in the Democratic Party. It used to be in this country. You'd see those kind of things celebrated even in the Republican Party. But it was more like in the 50s that we saw that. And so I submit to you that it is not only possible, but at least for this pastor, it is because I am a Christian that I am a Democrat.
Okay, keep it.
Okay? You're going to challenge me.
What I want to know is, sorry, gang, the religious communities that we find surrounding us, I find myself having very little in common with. How do you carry on a conversation with those pastors in Goshen or just friends that we've got, that these things they are doing are forcing their religious beliefs on me? Now, you're Presbyterian, I'm Mennonite. Would it be okay with you if I got elected to the Senate and as a pacifist, as a theological pacifist, I would get laws passed that would not let you serve in the military or support the military or believe? Would that be valid?
No. And, you know, one of the realities in our country is this misunderstanding that we were founded as a Christian nation. Our Constitution, in that First Amendment, has a clause about We call it the separation of church and state, but it's the establishment clause and the free exercise clause. The establishment clause says that Congress can establish no religious test, no religious requirement, no set church. We have this separation, that we are a secular government. The free exercise part of that First Amendment indicates that we can choose to be spiritual. And the vast majority of our population has chosen that. And so, one of the mistakes I believe that those on the right have made so much is by trying to influence people now by law because they've lost the moral argument about these issues. Okay, your response.
Let me be pertinent for right now. I was watching the interviews for the Supreme Court Justice, and the woman, I admire her. I admire her family, I admire her adoption of children, the values she lives by. I am not Catholic, and she is very, very conservative, traditional Catholic, as I hear her speaking. I would not want her passing laws that tells my wife what my wife can do with her own physical body. I will defend her right to try to persuade me that my views are wrong and I ought to buy hers. But I'm bothered when the religious community can't persuade people to change their beliefs, their life patterns, the way they live. So they try to get elected so they can legislate my behavior. I would object to that expression of religious faith. I'd like to carry on a conversation with you, but I don't want to pass laws that force you or force me to live by your religious beliefs, as valid as they are for you. I want to make sure you have the right to practice your own faith and beliefs. That raises then another one for me that I'll start with. What is the relationship between your own personal religious faith issues, which I hope have deep meaning for you and shape the way you live your lives? What is my responsibility to try to persuade the government that they ought to be doing things that in my faith, Jesus says we ought to be doing? That's where I'd like to start the conversation on health care. I see health care as a very, very valid human issue, but it's a religious issue too.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Going back to your last comment before that, do you all remember the old movie, The American President?
Yeah.
There's a scene in there that I just absolutely love. He'd been in this relationship and he tried to get this gun control thing, and it was watered down, and there was his girlfriend was trying to get environmental issues, and they came to disagreement on it, and when she finally walked out, he kind of had a come to Jesus moment, if you will, and really questioned, what was he doing? This was the last election he was going to do, and what was he spending his voice on? And so he goes into this press conference to take on his opponent on some issues, and he said, folks, democracy is really tough, because democracy requires you to defend the right of the person whose view most abhor their right to, at the top of their lungs, to debate that, to shout about it. And that's what our democracy is about. And we so often try to silence the other side rather than engage the other side. And we demonize our opponents. There are political views and theological views, quite frankly, that I absolutely abhor. but I'll defend anyone's right to have them, even while I spend the rest of my life trying to defeat their enactment into law or common understanding within the faith community, because I believe they're wrong. But I won't demonize the person for having those views. Might say their idea is really stupid, but their personhood should always be respected. And I think that that's a critical aspect of our faith, and that's not just the Christian faith. It's true for our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters. You know that the golden rule that you should treat others as you wish to be treated occurs in every single major religion on the planet. That's a basic human value. And we've gotten so far away from it, and I think it's really sad.
I wonder, how do I decide who I want to vote for? Do my religious faith values impact the way I vote in an election? And here I go back in my biblical background to the Old Testament prophets. Could we ask each of you to try to be the prophet speaking to the king? Brueggemann has a really good book out on speaking truth to power. What is the role of the churches here in northern Indiana to try to speak to the people who make the laws and have power in our communities about what justice is and about what it means to be fair and open and honest? I found a statistic somewhere yesterday, I'm going to trust it, that the majority of people in the United States Senate are millionaires. But they see themselves as common, ordinary, everyday American people. Well, then they sit down and pass laws for ordinary, everyday, average American people that must be millionaires. How do we make our voice heard, saying that we care about the poor, and maybe we do need different kinds of legislation? I was disappointed in Biden the other day. I was looking at his tax program. If you make over $400,000, your tax bill may go up. 400,000? Is that going to hit you? See, I wonder, how do churches become prophetic and allow their faith to speak to power in ways that power discovers there are people out there who are being fed to the slaughter because we're not speaking to their issues? And therefore, you're right, you got to start by listening. One thing I don't like, please don't call me a preacher. I'd rather be a teacher. In that sense, because we need to listen and hear each other and discover, how do we as a faith community bring to the surface the issues that are affecting the lives of people in our communities who don't know where their next paycheck's coming from because of the coronavirus, the lay down in offices and all that sort of stuff. How do we become that voice of truth, which is being shattered in our day? How do we become that voice of hope for people, that if we would work together, we might be able to make a difference in this world and people's lives would get better? I would like to inject that kind of faith life into our political life. That's not party lives. That's going to be holistic for people in our community. So maybe what we need to do is well, I'm not going to ask them, I'm going to do it. I'm a member of College Mennonite Church, and we, heaven help us, we got one of these PPE $75,000 grant. You remember what they were that they offered to protect the
payroll protection? The payroll protection.
Yeah, payroll protection. Our congregation, the leadership, applied for it, got $75,000. And a group of us went to the congregation and raised, in John Lewis's time, good trouble. We raised hell. And the congregation returned it. Now, we also then went to the congregation at Matchett. The congregation there, sorry to brag, but I'm really pleased with this, feeds about 200 people every week in Goshen who are undocumented, or who are laid off, or who are suffering other kind. It can be done. And most of us would be prepared to help do it. And then go to the government and say, here's the way you do it. Now take over and do it right.
How do we deal with issues of racism and white supremacy? How does the church speak to those issues? How do we make a difference? And I think that the first thing we have to do is to get real clear on a very simple part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. That we are all made in the image of God. No exceptions. That we are related to every other person on the planet. We are called to love others as ourselves. That is central with loving God. And therefore, with those premises, I think we have to declare that any behavior towards another that fails to recognize and celebrate that is sin. And I don't believe that the church in North America has consistently, and in some cases ever, declared white supremacy and racism and bigotry as sin. And so I think we have to start with that kind of understanding. So that's kind of a theological one. But then, just as our candidate has suggested, the idea of conversation is critical. You know, people most often fear what they don't know. And you fill in descriptions of them, whoever that group that's them in our lives are. We kind of create an image of them without ever knowing them. And so we in the church could be incredibly instrumental in bringing diverse groups of people together for conversation, for honest conversation, of finding out who we are and what we value. You know, I had a conversation, it's probably been 17 years ago, when I was fairly new in the community, and somebody made this negative comment about the Hispanic community and how they have so many cars in their driveways, and it was just unseemly. And I asked them, well, what value do you think that represents? And they said things like, well, lack of respect for your neighbors. And I said, well, I think it says something entirely different. I think it says how much they value family. Because that house isn't filled with mom and dad and that's it. That house is filled with family. Now, they may choose to live closer together, but it used to be we all did that in this country. And so, while you see it as a property issue, I see it as a sign of valuing family and connection. And suddenly their perspective changed. They still didn't like the cars, but they didn't seem to have the animosity towards the people. And I think that as we engage in conversation with people, where we listen to the concerns, but we look at the issues that are deeper, and the values that we share that are deeper, and then we can form those kind of connections that can make all the difference. And that's really what our faith traditions say, is that we're supposed to care about the other. and especially the least, the marginalized, the suffering. And those are the folks we're supposed to keep. Okay.
And no, I'm just saying. And the Quran says the same thing, and the Old Testament Torah says the same thing too.
Absolutely.
It's not an us thing. That is a God thing that shows up in all these places.
Absolutely. In Buddhism as well.
What?
Buddhism as well.
Yeah. I don't know where that came from, but we have developed, unfortunately, my wife and I lived in Scotland for 3 years, and then we spent a year in China with young people. And I discovered something there, that they saw what was good for them was good only if it was good for their neighbor as well. That which benefited them at the expense of their neighbor was not accepted in that culture. And that began to make sense to me. How can it be good for me if it's at your expense and makes you suffer? How do we work at building community where all of us benefit together and helping and by learning to know our neighbor, by caring about their needs, about sharing and walking, and maybe even sharing what I've got with them, because I'm relatively well off, white, middle-class American, educated. How do we build that sense that you are my brother, you are my sister, and we share a common humanity, even though you sit somewhere else on Sunday morning than where I sit? And I think that kind of encapsulates what religious faith really ought to be about. How do we establish the dignity of every human being? We don't call them by nicknames.
It's not popular to say this, but I'm going to anyway. I think part of the answer to that question, Alan, is we have come to worship money in our country. We are a materialistic, competitive society that believes that God's blessing on us need to be expressed financially, and our success as human beings depend on how much we accumulate. In that kind of an understanding, then, to be my brother or sister's keeper means that I'm not doing my first job of taking care of myself under that kind of prosperity kind of gospel, which I just think is a horrendous development with our country. You know, think about the size of American homes and how much they have increased in the last 100 years. That tells you about the shift of our priority. Think about how often decisions are made based upon what's good for the stock market. Our president tells us the economy is doing great because the stock market is doing great. Nowhere in our economic indicators do we talk about how the people at the bottom of the scale are doing. And any kind of a just evaluation of the economy needs to have both an indication about the stock market as well as how the little guy is doing. In addition, in my dream world, we would change the definition of corporate fiscal responsibility and fiduciary responsibility so that a board of director in a corporation's fiduciary responsibility isn't just to the stockholder, but also to the employee. And I think that is an incredible challenge for our nation.
I spent a couple of years working for a member of your congregation, and he taught me a couple of things. He said one thing is we ought to change the language we use so that on taxes, it's not the tax that you pay, but the concern ought to be look at what you have left after you pay. And he paid taxes. But he said, look at what I have left. And he told me, I would like to tell people anybody ought to live on $5 million a year. That ought to be tops. Anything you get over $5 million a year, you give to charity or give back to the government. And what could we do in caring and building our infrastructure and doing all those kinds of things if we had a premise of looking at the blessings I've got, rather than, boy, I got to write a check with 3 zeros behind it, whatever it is in that process. How do we establish that kind of a priority that says your welfare is my welfare and concern as well? I think Jesus worked at that, and it got him crucified. I don't expect that from me, but am I prepared to take the guff that comes on it? I think we may need to wind up.
Yeah, perfect.
When I look at this election, I'm making value judgments on who comes closest to reflecting those values which I believe are God's values for all humanity, whether they're irreligious, super-religious, or non-religious. How do we help people better discover that there is a hope for us for tomorrow without beating up on everybody else? I hope and I pray and I think we can do it. I think we can. I hear some good things going on, and I hope that we can reflect that in our communities here. One last comment from me. I had to do something the other day that I found really hard to do. I had to defend Donald Trump. In a community where the people were far more left-wing than what I am, even in it, were making comments about how evil this guy is. Well, I don't care about him, and I sure hope he doesn't get elected. But I need to also treat him as a human being with respect. He doesn't quite fall into the Jesus category of loving my enemy. He's not there yet. But I do need help sometimes at seeing him as a person who deserves to be understood, cared about, and prayed for.